The Dragon's Return, Chapter 26, The Secret Sharer, Part 2. It had been about a week since Arthur got Merlin back, and he was still no closer to figuring out who the traitor was. Merlin, who had become an expert at dodging his questions over the last 6 years, had not spoken of it since Galahad had interrupted their initial conversation about it. Agravain had his own theories. He was convinced that Gaius was the traitor. Arthur couldn't believe it. Even less so when Agravain arrived in his room while he and Merlin were having breakfast together to report that Gaius was missing, as were his possessions and a horse from the stables. "I went looking for him this morning. My shoulder was twinging a bit after yesterday's training session." An oddity in itself that Agravain had decided to participate in that. "Sire," Agravain hesitated as he made to pull something out from under his cloak, his eyes flicking to Merlin. "Perhaps this is best spoken of in private." "Anything you wish to say to me can be said to Merlin," Arthur insisted. "I found this on his table," Agravain said, laying a book on the table before Arthur. It was a thick tome, as many in Gaius's chambers were, but the cover was emblazoned with the words Witchcraft, Sorcery, and Magic. Arthur blinked at the book. It wasn't that a book of magic had been found in Gaius's chambers, it was that he hadn't seen this one yet. Once Merlin's secret had been outed on the Isle of the Blessed, Gaius had nearly reluctantly taken Arthur through a rather long inventory of the restricted material cleverly hidden in his books and under Merlin's bed. He'd been a bit annoyed at the fact that they were hiding the real cup of life under a floorboard in Merlin's old room, but the swap made sense after seeing everything the cup could do. Anyone who broke into the vaults, which were not as impenetrable as his father had pretended, would have access to untold power if they put the real one there. But this book had not been among them. All the books they had were concealed behind false covers, enchantments that made them appear as other texts, or even as blank books, entirely waiting for physicians' notes. "Out!" Arthur ordered, and Agravain blinked. "Out, uncle!" Arthur said, his eyes flicking to Merlin, who was staring at the book. Agravain glanced her way and nodded, as well, backing out of the room and closing the door with a click. "It's not his," Merlin had confirmed. So Arthur had called off the searchers Agravain had set about, and knowing that Merlin would not stop until Gaius was found, assigned Leon to keep an eye on her and help her with whatever she needed. When Gawain failed to show up at training, Arthur figured he'd taken it on himself to help Merlin as well. Lancelot pulled him aside. "Sire, you cannot believe this of Gaius. The castle is running rampant with rumor that he's the traitor," he said lowly as soon as they were alone in the armory. "Of course I don't believe it, Lancelot. Gaius has cared for me since I was a child." He looked around. "And I know the evidence against him was planted." Lancelot frowned at that. "Evidence?" he asked. "Someone planted a book of magic in his chambers," Arthur said. Lancelot raised an eyebrow. "It wasn't one of their books. Merlin's never seen it." "Who found it?" Lancelot asked. "Agravain. He showed it to no one but me and Merlin," Arthur said, and Lancelot frowned. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Why was Lord Agravain going through their books?" "Someone is framing Gaius, yes, but if they were smart about it, they wouldn't have left the book out in the open, just where it could be found with a search. So why was he searching Gaius's chambers anyway?" Lancelot reasoned, and Arthur frowned. "Whoever's framing him isn't all that intelligent," Arthur offered. "Except they are, or they're trying to be. Discrediting Gaius may taint many people's views of Merlin," Lancelot pointed out. Arthur frowned. He hadn't thought of that. "Not that any believe the rumor. There's been much scoffing at it, according to Gwen." "If she can see to it stays that way, she should," Arthur said. Lancelot nodded. "What are you doing about this?" Lancelot asked. "Merlin's looking for him. Gwen and Leon are with her. If you'd like to join them, I will not blame you," Arthur said. He was well aware that at least 3 of his knights were there because of Merlin, those being Lancelot, Gawain, and Percival. Lancelot shook his head. "I'm right where she'd want me, protecting you," Lancelot said, and Arthur smiled lightly. Lancelot followed him up to his rooms, and they were settled in, going over a few of the training regimens for the younger recruits, when a knocking sounded at the door.
Enter,
Arthur called. Leon entered quickly, closing the door behind him. Merlin's found something, he said, nodding to the window. Arthur was on his feet in a moment, at the window. He spotted Merlin and Gawain riding out the front gates.
We should get after them,
Arthur said, snatching up his coat. Lancelot, who had followed him to the window, frowned.
Who's that?
He asked, pointing at the figure leading a horse out of the stable. Arthur frowned, doubling back to the window.
Agravain. What is he doing out this late?
Arthur asked. Behind him, Leon and Lancelot exchanged a look. The three of them took off after the others, but the night did not lend itself to their search. Arthur was forced to call off the search as night made itself known around them. As the wee hours of dawn began to break, the sound of hooves racing through the woods caught their attention, and each man pulled weapons. Gawain's horse, Rebel, burst through the undergrowth. He reined up when he saw them. Across the front of his saddle was Gaius, out cold, and a moment later Agravain followed Gawain's path. "Sire, what are you doing out here?" he asked.
Looking for you lot. Where's Merlin?
He demanded. "No time," Agravain said, glancing at Gaius. "He'd been abducted. He's in a bad way. We need to get him back to Camelot as quickly as possible." The Lord insisted. Arthur hesitated, a feeling of dread tying his stomach in knots. Lancelot mounted up. "I'll go after Merlin. You should get Gaius back to Camelot," he insisted. Arthur nodded, and the knights took off back the way Gawain and Agravain had come. Arthur and Leon mounted their horses and headed back towards the citadel with Gawain and Agravain, both casting worried looks at Gaius.